Keith Malthouse.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful. Can I also offer my congratulations to my honourable colleague from Murray for his fantastic exposition. I know he's a Member of Parliament, but he's also obviously an unpaid advocate for Visit Scotland. I will do my best to visit his beautiful part of the country, having had a fantastic February half-term there just this year. And also to congratulate the member for Liverpool-Walton, who's not in his seat on his maiden speech. He and I were brought up about 1.5 miles apart. Have obviously had fairly similar experiences of the city that we both come from, but have gone different ways in politics. I'm slightly older than him, so I guess I experienced the Liverpool of the hard left, and he experienced the city where the hard left had broadly been expelled and started to recover. Having heard his speech, perhaps they're back, but nevertheless I welcome him to his place. Before I start, can I also draw the House's attention to my register of interests? I am a small business founder and owner, and my business will be affected by some of the measures in this bill. Not, though, I'm happy to say anymore, making tax digital. And can I offer my thanks again to the Minister for his very reasonable and sane approach to the revision of this policy. He will know that I ran a low-level campaign to try and advise the government of the error of some of the measures they put into making tax digital early on, and frankly I'm pleased to see that the parliamentary system worked. The government proposed something, members scrutinised it and opined upon it. The Select Committee, the Treasury Select Committee, on which I sat and now sit, issued a report on this particular policy. The government listened to lots of industry groups and amended the policy to one that was then roundly and warmly welcomed by industry generally. And that's the way things should work. And I'm very pleased that it has in this particular instance. As I said to the Minister, I'm pleased to hear him announce from the dispatch box that the scheme, although delayed, will now be open for voluntary participation, and I assume that's voluntary participation also for corporation tax purposes, not just for VAT. I know that the new measure only applies to VAT, and that the government is going to consider including corporation tax from 2020, I think. But it might be sensible to allow companies, those who wish to participate for corporation tax earlier than that, so that the system could operate like the old self-assessment system did when it came in, that it was entirely voluntary for the first few years until 60% compliance was achieved. Once that was achieved, it became compulsory for everybody, and notwithstanding that people always grumble about paying their taxes, actually the transition was pretty smooth and seamless, and is now an accepted part of the tax landscape, as I hope that MTD will be in the future. The one area that I think the government may think about further in the next 2 or 3 years as they move towards greater implementation of the scheme is this notion of quarterly reporting, particularly for corporation tax. As I've said in the past, VAT quarterly reporting is a relatively simple exercise for the vast majority of businesses. They do not need advice on a quarterly basis for compiling their VAT returns. It's a simple calculation. Corporation tax is an entirely different exercise of deep complexity and, frankly, fear by a lot of companies. And for corporation tax purposes, no one communicates with the Inland Revenue unadvised. And this is where the problem exists, because the compliance cost of corporation tax, particularly for small businesses, is extremely high. The FSB estimated that the compliance cost for making tax digital would be about £2,500 to £3,000, even for the very smallest companies. But for medium-sized companies, it can run into the tens of thousands of pounds just to make sure they get their corporation tax calculation right, because our system, of course, is incredibly complicated, about which more in a moment. So fantastic on MTD. I will be an enthusiast for it on the basis that it's voluntary for the moment. Also very pleased to see in the bill the anti-avoidance measures that are in there. We have to remember about anti-avoidance. It's not just good for the Exchequer, it's actually good for all the other taxpayers, because recovering more tax from those who avoid it and evade it means that taxes for those who pay their tax on time and to regulation don't have to rise quite as high as they otherwise would, or in fact could be cut in the future. We also ought to bear in mind that the fact that the government has this proud record of, I think, 140 billion now recovered under anti-avoidance and evasion says something about the way the tax system was run before they came in. The fact that there was this amount of excess to be squeezed out of the lemon, to be found, says something about the way previous chancellors ran the system and perhaps about how they would in the future. And in particular, can I also join my colleague in welcoming the end of the permanent non-dom status. It seems insane to me that people who've lived in this country for decades could have a somehow beneficial tax arrangement compared to those who'd lived here and been born here for exactly the same time. And the government is doing the right thing, as I say, plucking this goose of non-doms enough to recover the money that they should be paying, but without too much of a hiss that these people migrate elsewhere. There are, though, two areas that I wanted to raise with the government where I recognise that something needs to be done, but where it has wider implications for the economy. The first is the change to the nil rate ban for dividend taxation. Now, I declare an interest as somebody, as a business owner, who is from time to time in receipt of dividends and who will be affected, like lots and lots of other small business owner-managers, by this change. And I recognise that I have to shoulder my share of the burden of dealing with our national finances. We are still running a deficit. We do have massive and increasing national debts that need to be addressed at some stage, and it falls to my generation of business people to help to do that. But we have to take care in this party about what our taxation policies, what signals it sends to people about how they should behave, what we value in society, and indeed about the nature of capital. In this country, we are incredibly good at inventing things. We have the largest agglomeration of scientific research in the planet, more Nobel Prizes in one Cambridge college than Germany and France combined. In fact, Trinity College, Cambridge, has more Nobel Prizes than Japan, the third biggest economy in the world. We are incredibly inventive in this country, but we're not very good at turning those inventions into companies. Putting capital and idea together in this country is something that we used to do under the great Queen Victoria, built our wealth on that ingenuity and buccaneering capital, but since then we haven't done it quite so well and with quite such frequency. Of the top 500 companies in the world, only 2 have been created in Europe in the last 40 years. There are dozens created in other parts of the world in the last 40 years, but only 2. Those 2 are both British, Vodafone and Virgin, but there should be a lot more. There are lots and lots of 18th, 19th and early 20th century companies in the top 500 from this part of the world, but no recent ones. And that says something about the dynamism of capital in this country. And as we look towards the future economy, we know that our success is not guaranteed. And there's a likelihood that we could become squeezed between the United States, with its incredible appetite for ideas and its romping capital, constantly looking to invest in those ideas, and China, with its incredible ability to spend enormous amounts of public money and its disrespect for intellectual property derived elsewhere in the world, and we could find ourselves squeezed if we can't close this gap between idea and capital. And the notion, by all means.
Thank you. Thanks to the honourable gentleman for giving way. There should be a relationship, shouldn't there, between risk and reward. And I think it's a very delicate balance. And may I ask the honourable gentleman's view on whether the balance is right with these measures?
Well, I thank you for his intervention. I was just about to come on to exactly that point, because the rise in taxation on dividend says something about the way we are treating the proceeds of risk.
Yes.
And it has always been the case, the argument always was, that dividends should be taxed less than income, because to recognise that risk, that, you know, more times than not, if you invest in a company, you're going to lose your money. In some spheres, in life sciences, a particular area of specialism of mine, 9 times out of 10 you will lose your money. If you invest in a drug discovery company, it's quasi-charitable giving. essentially. You are giving to the economy 9 times out of 10 for the good of your health, hopefully. And the notion that dividends should be taxed just as every other income starts to erode the idea that as a government, as a society, we want to reward risk-taking. And in future budgets, I hope that Chancellors will find a way to reinstill that sense in ordinary working people that they should think about starting and building their own business. Sadly, over the last couple of years, sadly over the last couple of years, the number of people who contemplate starting their own business, thinking about starting their own, has dropped. A couple of years ago, it was about 39–40%. The latest survey, it's only about 14% of people who are thinking about starting their own business. And the single largest barrier that stands in their way, that puts them off, is access to capital, is the ability to get the money to start their own business. Yes, please.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. On that point around innovation and the lack of it, or the diminishing amount of it, what is my honourable friend's view of the fact that many economists, notably the American economist Tyler Cowen, has recently been discussing how this lack of innovation, or this slowing down of innovation, has been happening not just in Britain, but in America, across the whole developed world. And so that would perhaps, not disregarding his view around the taxation aspects of that would perhaps talk about something more fundamental with our Western economies and how the economic system is working. And I'm just interested in his view on that point.
Well, it's a very good and a very broad point, and I could talk for a long time about it, but I definitely, if you wish. No, I mean, look, it's definitely my perception, and the evidence definitely shows that the operation of capital is becoming more and more sluggish across the Western world. As I said, of these top 500 companies, particularly in the EU, capital is incredibly sluggish. In this country, it's long been said that that is partly the fault of the housing market, that so much private capital is tied up in homes, in housing properties, because we like to own our homes. In other countries like Germany, where they don't, maybe capital is more dynamic, there's more capital for investment. But whatever the problem, and we do think there is a problem, government has a role in unlocking, in lubricating that capital out there. Now, I think the EIS, Enterprise Investment Scheme, and the Small Enterprise Investment, which are both very good and worthy, but have been pressing over the last couple of years for them to be deregulated, to be eased, to make it easier for people to invest. So you don't need an accountant and a lawyer and pre-approval from the revenue to achieve, in the case of EIS, quite modest tax relief and tax benefits in the future. And I think, a scheme that recognised the quasi-charitable nature of giving. I mean, frankly, I would like to get to a system where people who invested in a business got 100% tax relief up front on their investment, and then if they got to the end and there was a capital gains tax situation, paid their capital gains tax.
Great idea.
Nice problem to have.
Great idea.
When I've been starting my businesses, the last thing on my mind has been whether there's any capital gains tax to pay. Frankly, raising the money, getting going, thinking about paying the staff, finding an office, all the rest of it has been more on my mind. And I think that would be simple and easy and understandable, and would encourage a lot more investment in the drugs and therapies and technologies that we need for the future. Now, the government has on the cards a patient capital review. It was kicked off about a year ago under the chairmanship of Damon Buffini, who you will know, one of those much benighted private equity guys. But he is running this patient capital review, and I will be pressing the government, hopefully, for the conclusion of that review quite soon. The second thing, though, we have to bear in mind about the signal that we send with this change in dividend taxation is about young people. We've talked quite a lot about home ownership for young people, but the young people's ability to access assets in generally is something that should trouble us all. And that includes shares. And giving young people the incentive and the idea that it is beneficial and a good idea for them to build up a small share portfolio might be a good idea. Now, the government will say, quite rightly, well, they can start an ISA. Of course they can. And an ISA, you'll get your dividends in tax-free in an ISA. And in fact, I think in April, the ISA allowance is going up to £20,000 a year. So you can accumulate huge amounts of money in an ISA. But there's a problem with ISAs, which is that most people hold significant amounts of money in ISAs in cash. And there is no limit on what you can hold in a cash ISA, and in fact far too much money in ISAs is held in cash and not invested in the productive economy, and that's where we need it to be. So sending signals to people that they should be investing in companies... Oh, sorry, yes.
I thank the member for giving way. Does he not think that the problem, in fact, with young people and the lack of savings that they have is that they don't have enough money to save? Not that they don't have enough different methods to save their money in. There's a lack of money in the system. There's a lack of wages rising. There's an increase in inflation, and they cannot afford to save because they're spending too much money on rent and they're in precarious jobs.
Well, as I said, some of the problem is related to housing, but I mean the government has made huge strides in trying to increase the take-home pay of the lowest paid. So whether it's the rise in the personal allowance, which is going to rise even further, or the national living wage, which has raised rates altogether, or the apprenticeship scheme, which is giving young people a route to higher paid jobs by having more and more skills, there are lots of things you can do. There's going to be no overnight solution. But the point is, once the government manages to move young people up the income scale, and as they get older and accrete more money to them, we should be encouraging them to think about saving, not just about home ownership, but about saving for their future. We do it with pensions. We're now, through auto-enrolment, making their employers responsible for instilling in them the idea that they should be joining in pensions. And I'm trying to, I guess, think in decadal terms about the signals we send about the operation and dynamism of capital in this country, because unless we start planting some acorns now, we won't have some oaks in 20 or 30 years' time to sell, as we have done with all the companies that were founded in the last couple of hundred years. The second area that I just wanted to raise that arises in my mind from this bill is about the nature of the tax system in general. I mean, when you read this finance bill, and it is incredibly thick for what is actually a relatively short finance bill, the complexity of it is incredible. And when you look at some of the measures that are included in the bill, where the government is quite rightly closing down loopholes, the disguised remuneration rules that are in there, whatever it might be, you suddenly realise that our tax system has become a kind of game of 3D chess, where the government is engaged with business and individuals in a kind of constant cat and mouse around what has become a Byzantine system that is choking economic growth and economic development and distracting entrepreneurs and others far too much from their day-to-day work of creating wealth and jobs. Most small business people I know spend far too much time on compliance cost with taxation regulations, and this bill illustrates that in no uncertain terms. The other thing it illustrates to me is that it's going to become harder and harder for the government to tax the new economy. We've heard talk today of the fourth industrial revolution, and even in my working lifetime of 20-odd years, the nature of work has changed almost completely, and the way we do work has changed completely. My business is almost entirely cashless. There are vast corporations that operate without cash, that trade in one jurisdiction, fulfill in another jurisdiction, bank the money in a third and pay tax in a fourth. And chasing this money around, combined with this incredibly complicated system, is going to become harder and harder and harder. And one of the things the government has talked, and the Minister said, part of the reason for this bill is to maintain the sustainability of the tax base. They're worried that it's getting away from them. It's like a wild horse straining at the leash, at the reins, you'll be galloping off across the field, given half a chance. And so that, to me, means that we're going to have to do some fundamental thinking. Leash, reins, I don't know what you hold the horse with. That means to me that over the next couple of decades, we're going to have to do some pretty heavy thinking about the way we tax. We often talk about how much we tax, but we rarely talk about how we tax. How are we going to tax these enormous corporations that are bigger than nations? How are we going to make it fair between them and small businesses? How are we going to tax a changing economy of individuals, people who might have 4, 5, 6 different jobs, and somebody in this country might be performing a job in another country, but doing it digitally? All these things raise these questions, and for me, it seems to be becoming harder to tax in a direct way, and possibly easier to tax in an indirect way. And I've talked in this House before about the notion of getting rid of business rates which are biased against small businesses and certainly small retail business on the high street, and favour these massive internet companies. Getting rid of that, getting rid of corporation tax again, which is hard to collect and which compliance isn't great, and thinking about a turnover tax. Moving to an easy collectible turnover tax, which frankly, you look at a huge company like Amazon, completely electronic, totally cashless, they could pay their turnover tax every day. At the end of the day, they know how much money they've made, the computer tells how much tax there is, transfers the money across to the government. It would be an enormous win. Also, the advent of the cashless society means it's much easier to track people's turnover, to take that little clip that the government wants to pay for all the services we need. And I think in time, maybe not in my political lifetime, but certainly in the future, we might move to a situation where there are no direct taxes on individuals either, where tax becomes voluntary. You pay it as part of your spending. Indirect taxes through VAT, through duties, all the rest of it. Certainly for those at the lower end, that is the tax they pay. If you earn less than £11,000, the only tax you will pay is indirect, VAT and duty, and you pay it voluntarily when you spend. These are the broad themes that we're going to have to think about over the next couple of decades if we're going to be able to raise the money to pay for the services that the country quite rightly needs. So on that note, Mr. Speaker, welcoming the bill, I would like the Minister, certainly as the budget approaches, to think in decadal terms about the foundations we need to create now for a sustainable tax base and a vibrant economy for the future. Thank you.